Start your day with It's the Business. Here's Phil Dobbie.
Some of the biggest companies around today grew out of major economic downturns, like Microsoft, for example. So could the same be happening this time? I put that question to Jonathan Marchbank, an investor in early stage ventures.
That gives people the opportunity to repurpose, what happens, in urban centres and how we live. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity in lifestyle changes, not necessarily, I think, in industry changes.
Also today, Matt Hancock's plans to revise the NHS. Is it a power grab?
It strengthens accountability to this House, and crucially, it takes the lessons we've learned in this pandemic of how the system can rise to meet huge challenges.
And Biden's approach to China and the chairman of KPMG forced to step down. Was what he said really that out of hand? We'll also look at the day's papers as well. It's Friday, the 12th of February, 2021. Good morning.
And now, it's the business, making sense of it all with Phil Dobbie.
Well, we kicked off this week talking about Bitcoin. I'm a bit bored with it, I have to say, now, the whole Bitcoin thing. But I did see a quote from Michael Saylor, who's the co-founder of MicroStrategy, who invested big in Bitcoin, like Tesla has. And he says it has become the institutional safe haven asset. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he's got loads of it. He said in the modern era, cash is becoming a liability because the money supply is expanding at 15% and the purchasing power of cash keeps degrading. That is the line, same line that Max Kaiser used when we spoke to him early on in the week. The money is losing value because there's more of it, which actually doesn't explain why inflation is so low right now. I'm not seeing cash losing any value. Well, I'm seeing it lose about 1% a year. Not very much, is it? And if you have too much money, you can always reduce the money supply by making it harder for people to borrow money. And then the money supply shrinks as they pay it back into the banks. That's the way it works. I don't get the logic of these Bitcoiners, which is why we had Max Kaiser on to try and explain it all. Now the merchant bank, the Bank of New York Mellon, has said it's going to hold Bitcoin deposits for clients for the first time as well. The currency supposedly working against institutions is now part of them. Well and truly. And MasterCard, really? They've announced that they will allow merchants to accept select cryptocurrencies on its network starting later this year. And guess what those announcements did to the value of Bitcoin? Yes, it went up again, as it does when there's any bit of news about Bitcoin. And it's getting pretty close to 50,000 now, 50,000 US dollars. 4 years ago, it was worth about 850 to 50,000. What madness is this for something that we have created? Money that is not used for transactions, not very often anyway, but is just a store of wealth, which is the worst use of money. If we could invent money that was the other way around, that wasn't used to store wealth, but was only used for transactions, we would be in a much better place. Now, a revamp of the National Health Service. That was the big news yesterday.
The white paper is built on more than 2 years of work with the NHS, local councils and the public. At its heart, this white paper enables greater integration, reduces bureaucracy, and supports the way that the NHS and social care work when they work at their best together. It strengthens accountability to this House, and crucially, it takes the lessons we've learned in this pandemic of how the system can rise to meet huge challenges and frames a legislative basis to support that effort. My job as Health Secretary is to make the system work for those who work in the system.
There is more of that, but I can't take too much more of Matt Hancock, can you? We're hearing rather too much of him lately. That was him announcing a major reform of the NHS yesterday. It's proposed in a white paper. Strange time, don't you think, to be reforming the National Health Service in the midst of a pandemic? But more centralised control seems to be the intent. Now he's got a taste for it. More responsibility for the minister who's going to set the direction for the NHS based on his extensive medical knowledge, and basically wrapping the smaller health authorities into NHS England. More centralisation, because that worked so well, didn't it, with track and trace? I mean, I would have thought the local model, which is where we were headed before this mob came along, is the best approach. I mean, the issue is privatisation of elements of the local health authorities that's been the big problem, isn't it? But what if you had no privatisation? What if you basically had everyone who worked for the local health authority getting paid by the local authority? So you've got your local GP, the specialists, the nurses, all the hospital staff, all on the same payroll. Because from a cost point of view, then the local health authority would be trying to cure you for the lowest possible cost. So local health services could use telemedicine, for example. You could get a specialist on the line if you're with your GP and there's something wrong and he needs a specialist's advice. He doesn't have to worry about how he's going to pay for that specialist, and the specialist doesn't have to worry about charging you because they're on a salary. The GP can just call them up and say, hey, look, take a look at this. What do you think? And that should speed things up and cost less. And each local area could try new and different ways of doing that sort of operation suited to their own local area and their own demography, the people who live in that country. Now, I'm not an expert at health in any way, but I would have thought local services need to be administered locally, and the real issue is really semi-privatisation of the health service, not whether it's centralised or whether it's localised. I don't think GPs should run their own practices, or dentists. I think they should all be paid a decent wage by the government, by the local health authority. And, and also if you can afford it, I think you should pay for those services as well, which is what you do in Australia. You pay a small gap fee for going to the doctor unless you are hard up, in which case the state pays for it all. But this centralisation focus, Nigel Edwards, the chief executive of the Nuffield Trust Health think tank, says ministers may come to regret all the new powers they are set to be granted over hospital closures and downgrades and directions to NHS England. As earlier governments learned to their peril, centralising power means you centralise blame and create more pressure to interfere. And that's the problem. Can you imagine Matt Hancock making all the health decisions? I mean, just the slightest outbreak of anything, just a little bit of flu, would be back to where we are now. We'd never get out of our houses ever again, would we? If Matt Hancock had total control? What a horrifying thought. So let's have a quick look at the newspapers this morning. The Telegraph says pandemic risks repeat of 1930s chaos, says Forces Chief. Nothing too alarming about this. General Sir Nick Carter warns economic crisis in the wake of COVID could stoke nationalism. That's the way it tends to work, isn't it? When the chips are down, blame the foreigners and make sure they don't get any of our vaccine. How dare they? Even though we obviously need to vaccinate the world before life gets back to normal everywhere. There's no quick fix, says the Metro this morning. We must not ease lockdown, warns sage scientist. That's Sir Jeremy Farrar. Never heard of him. But he says, this is quite logical. He says if transmission was as high as it is now and we weren't in lockdown, we would be going into lockdown. So we shouldn't be talking about coming out of it, because we'd be going back into it. You can't fault the logic there, can you? It's in and out and shaking it all about. Wasn't that the hokey cokey? In out. You do the hokey cokey and then you all fall down. Actually, I think it was a song, wasn't it, about disease at some point. Whenever they were writing it, people were falling down. And in and out, going in and out of lockdown. Who knows? Maybe. The Guardian has a picture of Meghan with her comprehensive win against the Mail on Sunday for them invading her privacy. So now newspapers are reporting on how she fought for her privacy by putting her picture on the front page. I don't know why we don't just leave them alone. Then everyone will be happy, because who cares? We don't, and she doesn't want us to be prying. Well, except when she wants us to be. Also, a story about Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, pushing ahead with the £27 billion expansion of Britain's road network without doing the necessary environmental due diligence. He just got on with it. He must have slipped his mind. He just got on with it. And the Bank of England chief economist, Andy Haldane, has written a piece in the Mail today, the Daily Mail, which runs with the headline, UK is set to roar back. Here's a good positive piece. Britain's economy will bounce back like a coiled spring once liberated from lockdown. This is what Andy Haldane predicts because we are desperate to get our lives back, he says. He predicts by the end of June, households will have amassed accidental savings adding up to a colossal £250 billion and will want to get out and spend it. But do you think we will do that, race out, just because lockdown ends? I don't think so, because I think social distancing is going to be with us for a long time, so it's still going to be hard to spend it, isn't it, really? I'm not sure we're going to be spending a lot of time at the pub, for example. In fact, the headline in the Times today, stay apart until autumn in lockdown easing. They say social distancing rules could remain for months as ministers plot route out. But Sage members are also warning Boris Johnson that his plans to get schools back on March the 8th will be too early. I think it will, don't you? But Matt Hancock, he's okay. He's booked a holiday in Cornwall. So have I, actually, if the truth be known. I think everyone wants to go to Cornwall, don't they, this year? Because we know there's a beach down there, apparently. And it gets reasonably warm. And it's quite nice. But there's not enough rooms. Maybe we need to let the people of Cornwall leave so we can move in. I mean, we've got so used to authoritarianism now, maybe it's just a small step for the government to requisition homes in Cornwall so we can all go and stay in the West Country, sort of on a timeshare basis. Then they can get their homes back when it's all over. Nothing on the front page about Matt Hancock's health reform plans, though. Perhaps they've all got sick of listening to him too. Anyway, there we are. That's the papers. Strangely enough, all about the vaccines.
It's the business, making sense of it all.
With Phil Dobbie.
So if you were expecting the Biden administration in the US to harbour a new era of entente cordiale with President Xi's China, well, you might just have to reassess that, because it looks like Biden is going to go just as hard as Donald Trump. He may not do it the way Trump did it, but it doesn't mean he's not going to confront the Chinese president. In fact, he did yesterday. But here he is last weekend on CBS.
He doesn't have, and I don't mean as a criticism, just a reality, he doesn't have a democratic small d bone in his body, but he is... The question is, I've said to him all along that we need not have a conflict, but there's going to be extreme competition. And I'm not going to do it the way that he knows this, because he's been sending signals as well. Then I'm not going to do it the way Trump did. We're going to focus on international rules of the road.
And marvellous, isn't it, to have someone, at long last, who wears long trousers in the White House. And yesterday, Biden finally did pick up the phone and call President Xi. I think it might have been arranged beforehand, just in case he wasn't going to be in. And Biden did get into the thick of it on the crackdown in Hong Kong, human rights abuses in Xinjiang, their actions against Taiwan. And this, after that call from the White House yesterday.
You have heard us talk about our strategic approach to Beijing. We are in serious competition with China. Strategic competition is the frame through which we see that relationship. We know that China is engaged in a range of conduct that hurts American workers. It blunts our technological edge. It threatens our alliances and influence in international organizations. And China is engaged in gross human rights violations that shock the conscience. So we will counter China's aggressive and coercive actions, sustain our key military advantages, defend democratic values, invest in advanced technologies, and restore our vital security partnerships.
So that doesn't sound too different, does it, to the approach that Donald Trump was taking, really? In fact, Donald Trump actually turning up the rhetoric over those 4 years might actually help Biden now to continue down the same road, pushing us hard, but maybe without the aggression. Maybe we'll discover that if you don't have the aggression, you actually get somewhere. Not that I'm not sure Donald Trump ever did show aggression directly. I reckon he was actually intimidated when he met world leaders, because he was always big on words when he was talking about meeting people, like talking about the little rocket man. And then when he met world leaders, particularly dictators, he was like a pussycat then, wasn't he? I mean, remember Kim Jong-un? They were like blood brothers for a while, weren't they? And hence nothing was ever achieved. So maybe the approach by Biden is going to be more effective. Let's see how that relationship works out with China. Can adult behavior from the US president with the rest of the world on side, see them change their ways, because I think we will discover that Trump-like behavior doesn't pay off. We sort of all knew that, didn't we? Except for the ardent Trump supporters who seem to quite like his bravado. But just ask Bill Michael if it pays off. A couple of days ago, he was the chair of KPMG. The Daily Mail referred to him as the Donald because he had this swaggering style. He was very much like the former American president. But now he's been forced to step aside. The Mail says because of complaints from his woke staff. The complaints were over his attitude during a conference call in which basically he said the staff should stop moaning and stop playing the victim card when it comes to COVID-19. This is him. This is what he actually said.
Take as much influence of your own diary, of your own life, of whatever, because I have spoken to a lot of partners and people at all sorts of levels where it almost feels like this is being done to them. Well, you can't play the role of victim unless you're sick. I hope you're not sick and you're not ill. And if you're not, take control of your life. Don't sit there and moan about it.
You know, I mean, it might have been a bit out of hand, but really, I mean, stepping aside for saying his partners, because he was talking about the people who work for him, partners in his business who've been complaining about the situation that they find themselves in. Look, and he's doing all right. I know he's on 1.7 million a year, so I'm sure he's not holed up in a tiny apartment with 2 or 3 homeschooling kids. So he doesn't know what it's like for a lot of people. But similarly, his senior staff are not in that position either. I mean, they might be a little bit miffed at KPMG because the average salary for partners has gone down from £640,000 a year down to £572,000 because of the fact that they're taking in a little less revenue because of the pandemic. So if they're complaining about their situation, about the pandemic and how hard it is for them, well, I am with the Donald. I'm with the Australian who's in charge or was in charge at KPMG, or who was the chairman of the board. They should stop whining and be in charge of their destiny, surely, unless, as he says, you are ill. Otherwise, I think he's got a point. I mean, he may sound a little bit aggressive, but, you know, that's because he's Australian, mate, and that's the way they talk. But a bit of an overreaction, I thought. But Dr. Marja Karika, Associate Professor of Organisation and Management at Warwick Business School, she says lack of empathy, dismissal of legitimate concerns, and focusing only on results may have got Mr. Michael to the top, but staying there effectively necessitates the very opposite. Such behaviour is incredibly disappointing to see, she says, in a pandemic to boot. It indicates a lack of connection and perspective beyond your own inevitably privileged and sheltered reality as a leader. I mean, these are workers at KPMG we're talking about, not down at the local council. Wisdom in leadership means knowing this for a fact and putting in place structures to ensure your disconnect doesn't work against you or against the organisation. It also means knowing that power corrupts. Mr. Michael should have remembered this, or better yet, appointed a team around him, not fearful to remind him of it daily. Without it, we get this. We get him saying that people should really stop whinging and just get on with it and cope with the pandemic, because they've got a job, they're working, they have it better than a lot of people. I would have said, so I'm with him, but I don't know. I might be out of touch as well. Not that I've made it to the top of anything, but you tell me what you think. Phil at itsThe.business. I'd love to get your feedback on that. And one way you can do that, if you don't want to send an email, if you go to the website and click on contact, you can actually click in there and send me a voice message, and I'll play the voice message on the program next week. Now, we haven't heard too many stories yet, but I wonder whether this pandemic will be the era that spawns some new mega companies, the next Facebook or Google. After all, many companies did emerge from recessions like Netflix and Apple. And think of Microsoft, and think of what the world was, economically speaking, in 1975. We had a 16-month recession in the United States. Through 1974, the whole economy fell by 0.5% in the United States, then a further 0.2% in 1975. And out of that came Microsoft. So out of adversity come opportunities. Jonathan Marchbank is an investor in early stage ventures. So will we see this happening this time? Some sort of a brand spanking new way of taking on the world by storm because the world has changed and it's an opportunity?
Gosh, well, it's hard to say because I think there's a lot of brand spanking new ideas already taking the world by storm. And to a certain extent, those ideas have been halted by the pandemic. So, electric vehicle penetration, for example, electric vehicle charging.
And that's just because there's not the capital to take those ideas forward. Is that the problem? It's sort of like they've taken a back seat, if you excuse the driving analogy, but we'll be back again.
Yeah, my personal view is that we're all on pause. There's enough big things happening thanks to the internet and thanks to the global tech giants and thanks to the greater socioeconomic things happening in the world that I don't think the pandemic is going to, or the current recession is going to change anything. The only thing it might do is there might be such things like the regulatory breakup of tech giants like Facebook and Google and Apple, which might be regulated into smaller pieces, which means there'll be opportunities for small companies to start up again and compete with them on a micro level.
Yeah, and which would have happened anyway. Well, it was happening anyway, wasn't it? I mean, that we were going down that road long before the pandemic hit. But what about large companies that are heavy in debt as they try and manage their way through this? Does that provide an opportunity for more nimble companies to come along and perhaps just improve on an idea? Because one of the big companies, obviously, however innovative they may have been at the beginning, they become slow to move. And if they get held back by a major recession or double dip recession, doesn't that give the opportunity for more nimble players to come on board?
It does, but I have a slightly different take on that, which is I used to work for Nokia, and obviously I was working with Nokia when we were blown out of existence by the creation of Apple. And Apple blew us out of the water because they combined all of their software and their media and their content along with the device, along with distribution channels, and went global. And all of a sudden, this whole new business model is created, and it's become a giant. But my personal view is it's not bankruptcy or people going into debt that's going to cause the change. It's the fact that no one company can control all of those different industries. And Apple and Google and all of the tech giants are pretty much now the media players. It's where you get your news. It's it's how you make your payments. It's how you make your telephone calls. It's how you pretty much do everything with your device, and your device is made by two people, and the software inside it is controlled by two companies.
Yeah.
And that is not a sustainable model.
So you can see that happening. What about changes in behavior as well? That during this pandemic, we are flying less, we are communicating more online. Does that create new opportunities for new players, or do you think that behavior is just going to revert back to how it was? Is it an opportunity to capitalize on those changes?
Well,
or would that be dangerous?
I live between Sydney and London, and both city centres are desolate right now. So when I walk around, and I think why are people going to? And I know people who were working in London who have now negotiated to work from far outside London, some of them even overseas, doing the same job. So city centres, I think, are going to be completely redesigned from a retail, from an office point of view, from an accommodation point of view, and that gives people the opportunity to repurpose. What happens, in urban centres and how we live, and so I think there's a lot of opportunity in lifestyle changes, not necessarily, I think, in industry changes.
Well, we were talking about this yesterday on the program that companies like Rework, the opportunity to have rather pleasant office space in your hometown, so that you don't need to go into London or wherever it is, and you can mix with other workers from your local town. I mean, ideas like that could be of the right time, couldn't they?
I would disagree, only because
you're allowed to, because you disagreed with my basic premise that we were going to see a whole lot of startups coming out of this. So that's fair enough. Take me on this one too.
Yeah, well, I do. I honestly, I just feel like that. I think there's so much change going on anyway now, due to technology, due to what's happening in the world. That if you look specifically at the pandemic and what's that really changing? It's just changing the way we behave as a consumer, and where we work, and what our social habits are. And I think that's where the opportunities are. And if you look at those opportunities, a lot of them have been controlled by big companies before. And I think the pandemic opens up some new behaviours that can be jumped on by innovative people.
Will they be jumped on by innovative people, or will the existing big players see it as an opportunity and get there first because they've got the resources to get behind it?
They have, but I don't know whether you've worked for any one of these big players before. But if you're Apple and you're already a media company, you're producing TV, you're producing devices, you're producing payment programs, you're in so many different industries already. You can't, by the law of gravity, keep being number one in all of these markets. There are people who are going to come with better ideas, more nimble, new investments, and there are large funds and lots of money around waiting for opportunities to arise.
But does that money exist, or are investors right now being very cautious? Well, they're certainly not being very cautious if you look at the US stock market, of course, where the NASDAQ keeps on hitting all-time highs. But that's putting money into established companies or trading on established companies. What about putting money in startups? Is there a bit of reticence to do that, given the economy?
My biggest issue, being one of the people who's still doing that right now, is that the way that normally gets done is by a lot of networking and a lot of traveling and a lot of experiencing things. And unfortunately for me, I'm locked inside now, and I can't get to talk to people, and I can't generate momentum and ideas when I'm sitting here, on my own at home, even on a Zoom call. Zoom's not ideal for being innovative. It's all right for being operational. But if you really want to get people together in an office and challenge the norm, then we need to get back to out of the pandemic and then start to get these ideas rolling.
So if you're one of those people who's got those ideas, what's your advice to them then? That they should just keep on working on that idea till you can get those face-to-face meetings. Just work as much as you can from the bedroom floor.
Yeah, I'll give you an idea. I put a very large sum of money into a company in Singapore, which was a startup, and the revenues were supposed to be coming in thick and fast by now, and this year we'll probably do 10% of the revenue that we had forecasted in the first year. And the only reason is because of the pandemic, because the pandemic prevented us from creating revenue. So we basically had to fund the venture for another year before we can start to make the revenues. And it's just basically been a delay for us rather than a change in strategy.
Yeah, well, that's tough, isn't it? Well, thank you, Jonathan, for coming on. Best of luck with all of that.
No worries. Bye-bye.
Now, talking about innovation, The Independent yesterday reported that United Airlines has said they're going to buy 200 electric flying taxis to shuttle passengers to its airports. United has said they want a carbon-friendly way of transporting passengers short distances to hub airports in US cities, and they've brokered a deal with the flying taxi firm Archer, which makes electrical vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. These flying taxis can travel up to 60 miles in one journey at speeds of up to 150 miles an hour. I'm not sure I want that. Do you? One of the few places we can look and not see congestion is to look up into the sky. I'm not sure I want to look up and see lots of traffic in the air. Do you? I don't want to look up and see flying taxis. I sort of appreciate the idea, but just hope they don't crash into all those Amazon delivery drones that'll also be polluting our skies. Now, wouldn't it be, whether it's that idea or something that's going to be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, wouldn't it be great if the Reddit investors, rather than following their leaders and trying to bring down hedge funds and the like, if they put their money into startups and did good? If only Reddit could be used for good rather than evil. Instead, now, this week, they will have been getting their fingers burned because they've been ploughing their money into cannabis stocks. And you can, if you leave it too long, you can get your fingers burnt. But no, Tilray, one of those companies, more than doubled in price on Tuesday. And then yesterday, it halved that, which means it's back where it started, which means a whole load of people who piled in from Reddit, a chunk of them will have got in too late and lost lots of money, like lemmings or lambs to the slaughter. These people are crazy. Still can't last forever. They've got to run out of money at some point, haven't they? Now, look, Rodney Hobson is going to be joining me on Monday. We are going to talk about more sensible solutions to putting investment in shares in the share market, because we are going to look at those shares and categories that might show some potential as we come out of the pandemic, whenever that happens. Goodness knows. We're going to talk about that on Monday morning. Have yourself a great weekend. Don't go anywhere. Remember, holidays are illegal. And we'll see you on Monday morning. Thanks for listening.
It's the Business with Phil Dobbie. Listen online at itsthebusiness or wherever good podcasts are found.